The effect of transparency and compliance requirements. You've drawn the short straw on that one, Anders. What do you think they are at the moment and will be in the future?
Of course, more work, but being the chronic optimist, I look upon this as actually being a great opportunity for us to improve our reputation as a business. And because this is all about, and we know that, it's about patient privacy rights, it's about safeguarding our volunteers in our trials. But if we get this right and can get folks to understand that if we can share data more widely, that will, in context, actually help us improve healthcare in general. So it's about getting the data out there and making sure that it's available to everyone, and not having that continuous conversation about what are those big bad guys now going to do with it.
Who generally agrees with that? Who sees transparency as an opportunity to actually improve the reputation of pharma and clinical trials to show the world what you do? Who sees it as an opportunity? Okay. And who is mindful it's a bit of a threat? You might show your competitors what you're doing, you might lose business because of it. Anyone see transparency as a threat? Okay, well, that's interesting. We're positive about it. There must be some downside, though, to transparency. You talked a little bit about the extra work involved. Who'd like to pick up on that? Is it a big extra work, being completely transparent? Any one of you? I'm going to pick Jay to answer that. Go on, Jay.
So, the transparency approach, I think, from our perspective, is only getting more patients involved with their own data and point of care is fantastic. Having data out there so people in the public domain can make more educated decisions with their data is appropriate, as long as it's done in a consistent manner from time to time and company to company. I think that's the most important for us, the consistent approach to data and data sharing.
How many of you, if you were actually a patient in a clinical trial, would want to have access to all your data? How many of you would want to have a report afterwards to see what the trial found and what the consequences were and have a chance to discuss it? That's really interesting, isn't it? When we put ourselves in the role of being a patient, we all want this stuff. It's actually doing it in real life that makes it harder. I guess the flip side of the transparency is the compliance issues that transparency brings. What are they like for you, Patrice? Is compliance becoming a huge problem for you?
Not a huge problem for me, but can I just comment on the transparency first? I think there's a great opportunity for transparency to increase the quality of trials. And in return, I think it's going to put some pressure on the regulators, because after the publication of all the data, you'll have a lot of people interpreting the data and understanding why a drug was approved or rejected. And that might put a lot of pressure on the regulators. I don't know whether it's going to be positive or negative, but I see a feedback there for sure.
Do we have any regulators in the audience out of interest? Any regulators at all interested in coming along?
Willing to raise their hand.
That's interesting, isn't it? They're probably all here. They're just not putting their hand up. I don't want to get in. I'm just watching. I'm just... Yeah, how about you, Brendan? Because clearly with your clinical background, I mean, when I trained, we didn't often tell patients they had cancer. Doesn't that sound ridiculous? If we didn't think a patient wanted to know, we never told patients if they had multiple sclerosis, probably wouldn't tell them if they had dementia. It's interesting, telling the truth, which is ultimately what transparency is a relatively new thing in clinical medicine as well as clinical research.
Absolutely. I mean, we've moved a long way away from the paternalistic approach that was there when I trained, which is a good bit before you. I think we much more view patients as partners now. And when we do that, and when we're very clear to them that they're partners, they engage with that. If we try to cut them out from being partners, they kind of go off out into the wild and seek other means of expressing themselves, potentially more destructively. So I think we need to acknowledge those who participate in our trials as being true partners in the trial. And of course, who is the most important person in any study? It's the participant anyway. But we've never really acknowledged that up to now.
Is there any good evidence that transparency actually improves compliance with clinical trials, recruitment to clinical trials, patients wanting to come back and doing it again? So if you're very transparent about the process, do patients say, yeah, I'd line up to do this again?
I don't know if there is any proof, but I would like to believe that if you're a patient, feel that you are trusted, and that creates engagement. And I think that also helps in, for instance, in patient retention, which is a big dilemma for everyone.
I think the challenge it poses a little bit is the connectivity with the patient and the company and therefore potentially bypassing the physician. And I think that is a challenge that does come up. You know, the ability to communicate directly with a patient on their outcome in a company trial has positives and negatives for the industry that need to think through.
Has anyone here got any experience of increased transparency, making it easier to recruit or making patients want to come back and do trials again because you've been transparent with them? Who thinks it's likely to improve recruitment and retention if we're transparent and open? Probably is, isn't it? Yeah. Can you, any downsides at all then? We're apart from the sort of the compliance requirements and all the legislation it involves, are there any other side effects? Can patients use the transparency to play one trial off against each other to try and unblind trials? Are there sort of that sort of thing going on?
We talked a little about this earlier in terms of the use of social media and patients sharing information with other patients on the trial about side effects and possibly introducing some bias into the study and potentially patients shopping around to find the right treatment, going in at one site, believing they're on placebo and going to another site. So there are potential problems. I don't think we're going to get away from them. They're here to stay. Patients will use social media. We can encourage them not to, but they are likely to do that. We will have to monitor and educate, I think, patients on the consequences, and that's likely to be better than trying to put in the informed consent, you can't use social media. I think the informed consents are another problem that are now, you know, so burdensome that I really don't think they deliver the right information to the patient.
That's an interesting issue, isn't it? Because you're going to be absolutely transparent, then the consent form becomes, you know,
even worse.
Is it becoming almost impossible to actually truly get informed consent because it can't, presumably, to be truly transparent, you need a certain level of intellect to understand the consent form, do you not?
Yeah. Well, they're supposed to be targeted at, I think, 8th grade level.
Okay.
But that's very difficult, and these trials are very complex and require a lot of information. And then there's the legal information, the safety information, but very quickly, these are 10 pages, 15 pages long, and it's very difficult. I think when we get to the technology part, I think there are things happening in that area, e-informed consent, where we can perhaps use tools that are more interactive, quiz-like, and have the patient participate in that process rather than giving them a stack of paper.
Okay. Would anyone like to ask a question about transparency or compliance? We're very shy first thing in the morning. Oh yes, there's a person at the back. Can you tell us who you are and who you work for? Unless, of course, you're a regulator, in which case you won't want to. But wait till you get the mic. You've got the microphone? Tell us who you are, if your question is directed to anyone in particular.
Hi, my name is Andrew Mitchell. I'm the Director of Product Strategy at Intralinks. You talked about informed consent. In India, there's a video recording of the informed consent conversation as well as the document that gets signed, the form that gets signed. Do you see that kind of video recording of the conversation and recording of the dialogue between a patient and the investigator happening more and more in terms of increasing the transparency and helping to show that the patient is being aware and you know, not taken for a fool? That's fascinating. Anyway, outside India, any other countries doing this recording of the consent process and the interactions with investigators? Anyone else heard of that? I think that's brilliant because it's happening in consultations. Patients now are taking out their phone and recording the consultation with permission. But that's an interesting thing. Is that something that's happening more widespread?
I've not heard of it happening in other countries. And it's potentially a great idea to have that meeting recorded. But there are an awful lot of practical consequences around who gets to see that recording, where is it stored, how's it stored, and the fact that in certain cultures that video recording may be very uncomfortable, so may result in patients not participating in clinical trials. So I'd say the Indian government have jumped to a solution. I think it's one of the solutions that could be used. I think it probably needs to be adapted, and I think some of the other technologies that are around may be easier and more acceptable to patients than having a camera stuck in their face during a very difficult, personal discussion. I think that moves us seamlessly onto the technology question, which I'll come to next, about how we think new technologies are being used at the moment and will be used and implemented in the future to improve the trials process. Brendan, you were keen to talk about technology. What are your views of the opportunities there?
Well, the opportunities are, I think, shown by the fact that we're probably decades behind what's happening in the consumer world. So, it takes 10 days, 20 days, 30 days to get data in from a visit in an oncology trial into the database. But if my
30 days, did you say?
Yeah. But if my daughter in New Zealand goes out with her friends to a Starbucks, it's instantly available to me on Facebook. So there's a huge disconnect between how we do business because we are so conservative. And I think then there are, firstly, very simple opportunities to avail of connectivity and simple devices. On the other hand, I think it's easy to over-stress the potential for the Fitbits and the Polars and those kind of devices, which are consumer devices, not necessarily capable yet on the basis of evidence of being used to support clinical trials. So there's, on the one hand, there's an obvious progression that we should and need to make quickly. On the other hand, it's important not to just embrace everything in the consumer world and say that's, we're going to put that in our next clinical trial.
What's your view on this, Adrian? Because I know you're keen on the use of technology, but we suddenly get people are saying within clinical medicine, it's the way to manage chronic diseases in everybody's home. We'll just give them an iPad instead of sending the nurse around and we can solve everything. Clearly, technology has its limits, but how can you, A, accelerate the stuff that's proven to work, and B, not use the stuff that overpromises?
So I think there are two components that I talk about in this area. One would be the biggest problem we face is recruitment, which is a complex interaction of complex protocols leading to poor recruitment. And how do we use big data for that? And the other one's virtual trials. But to concentrate on the first one, I think there's a huge opportunity to allow the designers of our clinical studies access to big data, to allow them to understand what population are they aiming for, and if they add inclusion or exclusion criteria, what are the consequences for recruitment? Because frequently we start a study with a perfect study with a lot of exclusion criteria, and as we get into 6 months and it gets difficult to recruit, we adapt the protocol and we remove exclusion criteria to improve the recruitment. So I think that there are a number of tools we're exploring with Quintiles, their Infusario tool, which allows the designers of the protocol to look at the consequences of adding an exclusion criterion. What happens to your patient population? Does that reduce dramatically? And I think that will have a big impact on our ability to conduct studies, the speed at which we conduct studies. I think the other component around virtual studies, Pfizer did a great experiment a few years ago trying to do a virtual study in the US with Detrol, I believe. And although it was a failure to recruit, it was a great idea. I think I've heard that Genentech, Roche, are trying to repeat a virtual study using telemedicine. And that's an exciting component. So the big problem we have around sites is that we have an area whether you put 50 kilometers around that investigator as to where patients are willing to travel to. If we could change that to say wherever the patient is, we'll bring the physician through telemedicine to that patient, traveling those nurses that travel to the patient's home to deliver medication, to deliver other aspects of the study, assessments, labs, etc. And they're getting around the vital signs and physical assessment by getting around, that's not the right word to use there. They're using the patient's own physician for that assessment and not as part of the study personnel. So that allows them just to pay the investigator without us having to go and monitor that site. So it's a very interesting idea.
Do you envisage a time where you can do the majority of trials using Skype and some sort of Apple app that does your blood pressure, your sugar, your glucose? I mean, there are so many of these apps around now. You could monitor pretty much all the vital signs you needed to remotely, couldn't you?
It will become increasingly possible as the FDA and other regulatory authorities approve these apps for use in clinical studies. I think it's still some ways to go, and it will start in the simpler studies, maybe the phase 4 area, Some of the more complex may take some more time.
Sorry, Patrice and then Anders, what did you want to say?
Well, I'd like to add a little bit of color from a lab perspective on this. I think it's twofold as well. We should bring people to the present first, and after that, look into the future. So what I'm talking about bringing people to the present is you go to a lot of restaurants now, and you have a waiter with a pad, and they're just clicking, and they never go to the kitchen. Then they receive an alarm, and meal for table 6 is ready. You receive your meal, then automatically your billing, invoicing is done, procurement, ordering how much food they need to order the day after. I think in clinical trials, to take your point, Brendan, we're extremely conservative. And just to talk about the CRFs, for instance, and rec forms and pathology report forms, it's all manual. And I have nothing against pathologists. I don't want to make enemies this morning. But if you ask a pathologist, look in the microscope and put your finger on your pad over here to say it's +2 and it's a positive and what's the scoring system, there's a lot of pushback in the community at the moment. It's like, no, this is my piece of paper, and have 2 people manually enter this into your database. That's your job. And I think we're losing time. Back to your point, we have a lot of quick turnaround time to go back to the physician and give them the result, because the patients are waiting for a result to be either included or excluded or randomized. And we're waiting on the rec form to be completed. We're waiting on the pathologist to go back and say, you put an initial over here and an X, what does it mean? Is that truly a yes or a no or a plus? We can't read. I think we're wasting time. So that's what I mean by bringing the people to the current times. After that, we have to go into the future, I think. We used to brag about lab on a chip, and I think we will quantum leap to mobile device. And human beings are going to be mobile device with nanoparticles and apps. And already there are apps like this that are already FDA approved for glucose, HbA1c, for instance, inhaler, to make sure that you're compliant.
What do they have to be FDA approved? They've been proven reliability, do they?
Well, if they're not FDA approved, let's say they're not used, because we can talk about LDT for 5 hours here, lab developed tests, or home brews. But I think the regulators have to approve those devices, like Adrian mentioned, and then we can move
Sorry,
forward.
Anders first, then Jay.
I see two things here. One is that we still have a study process that is basically built on the way when we didn't have all this technology. Then we have applied different technologies to an old way of doing it when we still did everything on paper. So I think we are now coming into that era where we can actually turn it all the way around. We need to bring in some younger brains who are not stuck in the old way of doing it. Then coming back to the big data, I also say a study process, or many studies still being too much of trial and error. Okay, we write the protocol and then we go off and do it and hope for the best. And then we have all these amendments and change coming afterwards, and we make life difficult for our own staff, we make it life difficult for patients and for site staff as well. So I think the modeling you brought up is a great way, but also bringing patients into that exercise. So making prototypes before we lock all the systems, because that will create engagement on all levels and make it much faster for us to deliver the trials as well.
So a forward-thinking company will crowdsource their protocol. They'll put it out there and encourage responses from patients and other users and anyone. They'll take that hit that people will know what we're doing, but they'll say, actually, we can improve our protocol before we actually cement it. Is anyone doing that, or are they putting all their protocols up and in the public domain beforehand? Almost all of us. Look at that. We're terribly transparent. So, Jay, you wanted to come in on this, and then back to Brendan.
Just talk about a little bit of technology in the future, if we think what's fast forwarding. I mean, you have genomics and proteomics, which basically has the DNA of an individual. You have an electronic medical record, right, which is going to become digital, and you will be giving medicines in the future and measuring the activity and the outcome in real time in an activity band. And so you'll be able to measure the patients once the medicine is given in real time, and that is the future going to be, whether the technology and when it gets there is on the horizon, but ultimately seeing the output in real time of a medicine given based on proteomics and genomics is going to be the future.
Right.
I think it's very easy to get bogged down in confusing what we need to do to come to the present and then to view into the distance, and there's a big leap to be taken from a regulatory point of view, and time has got to be invested in proving that, we can say sensible things about Parkinson's disease if we put a Fitbit in somebody's hand. We don't have that evidence yet. Nobody has done the experiment. But coming into the present would be quite good. Just getting data in electronically by people entering data with mobile devices would be a very simple thing to do right now. The thing we can't forget in all of this is that clinical trials are experiments. So they've got to be designed as a scientific experiment with as little bias as possible in a manner which keeps the variance of observation small. And some of the suggestions where virtual trials and doing stuff off Facebook and all this kind of stuff, I think these move away from being experiments into some kind of attempt at a demonstration. And I think that clear distinction is very important to make at all stages in this process, and to ask ourselves, are we sticking to the integrity of the scientific process that ultimately will give assurance to the regulator, to ourselves, and to the public that the drugs that are coming on the market are safe and effective.
It's also interesting, isn't it? Because the opportunity for technology is huge, but transparency in some ways makes us more risk averse, doesn't it? Because to innovate, you have to make mistakes, you have to take risks, but in a transparent culture, they're all going to be in the public domain and people are going to know when you screwed up. So actually, it's making people actually more conservative in some ways.
When I go along to almost any sponsor, not quite all sponsors, but almost all, I would say, well, we have a whole suite of these ideas that are ready to go. They're all tested, they're all Part 11 compliant. And wouldn't it be great if we did one of your trials with this? And the answer that you always get back, almost always, is, how many trials have you done that have gone through the regulatory process, and how many compounds are on the market as a result of doing the trial in this process? And the answer, of course, is none. So they say, well, we can't take the risk. So you get into this spiral of a vicious circle of...
Brendan, I think this is a reflex.
Yeah.
Because the authorities are so conservative that people are not willing to bring new data or new approaches. Look at Pfizer's experiment. It took how many years to convince the FDA to do this, just to ship drug by mail. It taken months to convince them. So
we should celebrate that failure.
Yeah, indeed.
Your point is interesting about failure, because I think internally when we look at innovation at Celgene, if we've asked the right scientific question, right, and have a negative outcome but advance the science, that is considered positive, not negative, right? So this open architecture of sourcing so everybody can learn from somebody could be very valuable in the future, as long as you've asked the right scientific question to move the science forward.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, oh yes, this woman here has a question for us. Can you get the microphone? A lot of it is about, ultimately, getting the right data to the right person at the right time as quickly as possible. It's not about the technology. It's about what you gain. It's about empowering patients and giving them more control if they want it. Tell us who you are and what your point is.
Professor Sue Pavitt from the University of Leeds. So we were here yesterday at the pre-meeting, and Jenny and I gave a talk on patient public involvement and asking the right question. And it was quite clear that pharmaceutical companies really lag engagement with patients early enough in the research design process. And I think that, perhaps why some of your trials fail is because you haven't consulted early enough with the patients about what they want. We both gave very good illustrations of how that can really enhance recruitment and retention yesterday. And I think that's a first step in transparency, is you have to find a way of engaging with patients early enough. We've got a fantastic conference here today. There are no patients here, and you're talking about being in partnership. They are your key partners, and you have to find a way of engaging them because you learn so much from that.
It's a fascinating point, isn't it? There's a great phrase. One of my favourite whistleblowers, a chap called Steve Bolson, said, to stop scandals happening in medicine, never lose sight of the patient. And it's the same principle here, isn't it? We have the same problems in clinical practice with compliance or adherence that, maybe 1 in 3, maybe half patients, if you're lucky, actually take their tablets in order for them to be effective. And when you ask it why, it's because nobody sits down with the patients and say, what is your main concern? What are your goals? What do you want to get out for this? We don't actually measure, for the vast majority of medical interventions, whether patients' lives are improved, whether they can get up and down the stairs, whether they can go on the trampoline with their grandchildren. It's the whole of medicine, not just research, suffers from actually not engaging patients closely enough.
Could I put a contrary view? I would say that there are 850 patients here.
Yes?
So we really, I mean, I have a fine attack of gout today from drinking too much last night. So we're all patients, or we will shortly be patients. So it's, we're not...
Hopefully not in the next 15 minutes, Brennan.
That's right.
I'm hoping to get you through to 22.
At least there's a doctor in the house. Several.
So, Anders.
Can I ask a question to the audience? How many or even better, how many are routinely asking patients in clinical trial how they experience the trial itself?
Put your hands up high so we can see. We have very sheepish hands this morning. We've got these morning hands that I'm not sure. So not a huge number. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Because what I'm after is that we're asking so much specific data on the disease and the disease progression, and hopefully it improves and all that. But how miserable are we actually making the life of the patients through the trial itself? Because that's, for me, the connectivity coming back to having that patient being interested in coming back and being part of another clinical trial, and also the big question about patient retention.
We have so much to learn from patients. A friend of mine is a pain consultant who works on the south coast of England, and he was teaching a junior doctor in his clinic, and the next patient came in, and he saw on the notes it said Wartenberg's neuritis. And before she came into the room, he said to his junior doctor, I've never heard of Wartenberg's neuritis. I've got no idea what it is. Let's look it up on Wikipedia. So they consult Professor Wikipedia, and there's a whole page on it with lots of really detailed stuff. And I think this is amazing, and they're giggling like a couple of schoolboys, making notes on Wartenberg's neuritis. And they invite the patient in, and this woman walks in and says, look, I'm terribly sorry, doctor, but I was standing outside the clinic door. I heard you say to your junior doctor you'd never heard of Wartenberg's neuritis, and you were going to look it up on Wikipedia. And I thought I ought to perhaps warn you that I'm the person who wrote the entry on Wikipedia.
Wow.
That's actually how it's working now. The expert patient who knows more about their condition than the people treating them. And that sort of moves us on to our next topic, which is the use of social media, because you talk about trying to do things in a strict control way, trying to control for as many confounding variables, but actually we have no control over social media whatsoever. So you can get websites trying to unblind trials, you can get people sharing data, you can get people recruiting themselves into several trials at once and not telling you the same trial twice. How do you... Let's talk about the good points about social media first. What do we think the opportunities of social media are in a research trial context? Who wants to take that one?
It's an interesting tool to recruit patients into studies. And I think that it's showing promise, but like everything in our industry, it becomes, the thing that is going to solve our problem. I probably would be in the less optimistic camp on the social media, at least for some years. I think patients still have a connection with their own physician, and it will be difficult to break that completely and to just enter a trial based on social media. It will happen for a proportion of our patients, but I think it's going to take a little while before it is a dramatic game changer for our industry.
I mean, it's an interesting evolution, social media, because the first experience I've had of social media was about 18 months ago, and I got this form that said, no executive at Celgene can Facebook or tweet, right? So that was the social media, right? And fast forward now.
Did you comply with that?
Absolutely.
Just checking.
Hashtag.
They're tweeting here, so be careful what you say.
Hashtag JK. But now, as a company, and most companies are doing this, for some of our very large conference, we are tweeting out on an hourly basis, events, data, et cetera. So on one hand, we're talking about how to control a patient, and on the other hand, we want it the way we want it. And I think, again, if you're advocating from a patient perspective, we're going to have to figure out and listen very carefully to the patient and harness that, not just from an enrollment perspective, but a knowledge-based crowdsourcing on protocols. There could be other real ways to engage patients, and it's probably happening anyway, so we should embrace the positives in this area.
There's that great quote that the future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed. There probably are people using this. Anyone use? Yes, tell us your experience of social media. This woman here, if we get to the microphone, just halfway down on the right here. Oh, we're running. I like that. Very good. Brisk walking. Excellent. Put your hand up to take the mic. Tell us who you are.
Good morning.
It's on.
Okay, good morning. Ilaria Di Resta from Esperate is a foundation that is dedicated on rare disease, and just a note more than on social networking, more on the patient perspective. In rare disease, we are kind of forced to liaise with patient association. Actually, they are the one teaching us what is the disease, what they really need. And maybe, you know, also from other indication, we can learn from a rare disease perspective, because this is where we really need the patient engaged, because otherwise we will never run a study. And again, social media, they use a lot social media, and they do have many networking conferences.
That's an important point, isn't it? If we want to try to solve the challenge of rare diseases, where the margins are less and you really need to try and make big progress, you need to listen to patients, don't you? Because there aren't many of them, and they're the ones who have the information you need. So, anyone else using social media regularly in their research protocols? Yes, this gentleman at the back here with his hand up. Tell us who you are and what your experience is.
This is Mahesh from MacroCare. A lot of surveys suggest that it's 95% of the patients doesn't know about a trial. So rather than thinking about social media as a recruitment, we should see it as spreading the awareness again, because that's the first channel. If people know something, I mean, taking an action is next. But again, a lot of people don't even know about clinical trials, a lot of patients. So I mean, social media should be seen as a first step, rather than trying to do it all in social media, maybe stepwise. Being a conservative industry, again, we should think about, let's start with spreading the awareness of a trial, which is where I think we can make a lot of progress to start with. Just a comment.
It is interesting. I've got, Scully, about 30,000 Twitter followers, and I regularly get people saying we're running this trial for this or whatever, and I have a look at it, and if it looks okay to me, I will retweet it. And who knows what the spread of that is. Potentially a huge spread, isn't there? If you get one or two people who have a fair number of followers to retweet a trial, you might get a pretty impressive coverage. Yeah. Is that happening? Is that a widespread thing at the moment? Are you encouraging people to get out there and tweet about a trial, or is that off protocol? No, it's not happening.
Not much. From a corporate perspective, we are using Twitter quite a bit as a colleague shared, for information about trials.
Is your company monitoring your own Twitter output? Will they come to you and say, Jay, that one of your tattoo probably wasn't appropriate? Do they do that? I mean, do you get any feedback on your tweets? Are they? They're
all blinded tweets, so nobody wants to say who they're giving the feedback, but no.
It's really interesting. I mean, from a consumer point of view, British patients aren't thought of as being terribly consumerist, but now very quickly, if you go into hospital, the sheets aren't clean, there's blood on the floor, your grandmother's got a pressure sore, you take a photo, you hashtag it with the hospital, you hashtag it with the chief executive of the hospital, who nearly always has a Twitter feed, you post it up there, and people get responses really quickly. Now, you've got to be quite ballsy to do that, because some people think if I complain, they might discriminate against me, but actually, it's out in the public domain. Journalists then pick up on it and they go, whoa, there's a problem there in this particular hospital, and they sort it out. And you may find that's going to happen with trials as well. You may find people are saying, look, I took this and this happened, or that happened, or they said they'd do this and they didn't. So I think you need to monitor your Twitter feeds, otherwise you'll get an unpleasant surprise. But also embrace it. Okay, because we're moving on to the rather wonderful Transcelerate, which I think is a great concept. We're just going to talk finally a little bit about data mining and data integration. Presumably, with all these risks involved, the future must be about collaboration more than competition, mustn't it? It must be about not just efficiency and sharing the back office and the sort of pre-competitive space, but also you're sharing the risk more, which is actually ultimately what it's all about, isn't it? Do you see data mining and combining huge amounts of data together and integration as the way forward for industry and for trials?
I can start. You brought up, you said pre-competitive space. If we look back 10 years, because the topic here is also what's going to look like for the next 10 years. Something that has dramatically changed, according to my opinion, is the pre-competitive space. I think some of the conversations we are having today, we wouldn't have had those 10 years ago. The pre-competitive space will continue to evolve and will quite dramatically. And because the differentiating factor will eventually be the molecule itself. So the more we can standardize, and that also then includes coming back to the data will come out there in one way or another. Again, linking back to transparency, publishing everything, making all data available. And the big data factor comes in, that those who are capable and have the time and the interest actually to dig into all of that, but it will eventually come out here. So the differentiating factor will eventually only be the molecule itself. And I think we will all gain from that, because it will speed up the process, it will make it more efficient, it will make it cheaper, and ultimately new medicines will come out faster.
And this is happening at the moment. I mean, if you look back on the last 10 years, would you say there's been a big change in the way trials are conducted over the previous 10 years? And are we going to keep accelerating, or still it is fairly much as it always was?
Trials conducted, maybe, but in terms of collaboration, I think that it's dramatically changed. We, in fact, are probably facing a profusion of collaboration groups, CTTI, Transcelerate, MRCT, the list goes on, and I think we have to be careful that there isn't duplication and overlap. So this is a good thing, but we have to make sure that there's clear connectivity between these groups so that we don't waste effort between these groups.
I think the challenge you have in this data integration is you have research data, you have clinical data, you have patient data, and then you have unstructured data. And how to integrate all four of those to make meaningful conclusions when driving trials is a bit of a challenge, because there isn't standardization in the industry. And a big piece of it is the unstructured data at a patient chart that we have yet to figure out how to structure and integrate when driving patient outcomes in trials.
It's interesting, because coming back to the original point about not losing sight of the patient, as a frontline doctor, my biggest challenge is a lady of 86 on 28 tablets a day, all of which have been proven to work in 28 separate clinical trials. We've got absolutely no idea what the effect of multiple medications on old ladies and gentlemen with multiple comorbidities is. My hunch is a lot of people are being misdiagnosed with confusion and dementia because of the side effects of the multiple medications they're on. So are we going to be able to embrace the real-world data challenge, which is perhaps the biggest challenge of all, isn't it? Is ultimately personalizing medicine to an individual's genome and then understanding all the little bits of risk we're trying to shave off their profile.
I think there's great value into this, but it will require standardization of data, and I think publication of data might force convergence of harmonized data delivery. And just think about the drug-induced liver injury initiative from the FDA. The guideline came out in 2009. The concept was way back then in the 50s. But still, it was very empirical in one way, but not really fact-based on clinical trials. If your AST, ALT are threefold above upper normal limit of normal, and if your total bilirubin is twice as high, then you're flagged. But no one really refined this algorithm. And if you look at the integration of data, in 2013, there was a publication looking at 31 trials in oncology. And they started to refine this algorithm, and they found dramatic difference between the high law as it is now and what should be out there. 31 trials. Can you imagine if we were to do this across thousands of trials to really define, having better predictive tools to look at liver toxicity and drug response? I think there's great value there.
You a fan of big data, Brendan?
I'm a fan of analyzing data to test a hypothesis. There is a kind of concept that, you can go to a huge rubbish dump and plow through it and find a gold bar. I think it's the challenge with the data that we have, and we have enormous amounts of it that we never look at. In fact, 60% of what we collect in clinical trials are never analyzed, even for that trial. But I think the challenge, there are obvious questions to ask around inclusion-exclusion criteria, for instance, really simple ones. There are questions that we can ask about what are good sites, what sites aren't good. But we never ask them. We have a responsibility to patients whose data these are, because they give them to us for an altruistic motive usually, and then we do nothing with them, and that I think is I have an ethical issue with that. So we need to move much more into structured, hypothesis-driven data analysis, and to approach it in that way rather than say, well, big data is the answer to everything.
So 2 interesting concluding thoughts, I think. The first is never lose sight of the patient, and the second would be never lose sight of the scientific method. Because beyond all this excitement of new technology and big data, actually we still have to be doing good science, and we have to be doing good science that benefits patients rather than bank balances. So thank you so much to our wonderful panel, Brendan, Patrice, Jay, Adrian and Anders.